Legendary performer Michael Landon was a celebrity famous for his parts in Bonanza, Little House on the Prairie, and Highway to Heaven. Nevertheless, there existed much more to his existence than most individuals realized. The concluding installment of Little House on the Prairie did not merely conclude a program, it devastated emotions. For almost 10 years, Michael Landon had served as the motivating power behind everything, molding every sob, every victory, and every teaching in Walnut Grove. But whereas spectators observed the tenderness of Charles Ingalls behind the scenes, Landon was combating struggles far more profound than anyone comprehended. Years afterward, after his sorrowful identification and premature demise, admirers would reflect on that ultimate installment and ponder, was it truly just imagination or his subtle farewell to the planet? The Ascent of Charles Ingalls. Michael Landon did not simply portray Charles Ingalls, he transformed into him. When Little House on the Prairie initially broadcast in 1974, viewers immediately became enamored with the power and empathy that emanated from his acting. Week after week, Charles Ingalls became an emblem of honesty, optimism, and endurance. But what most observers did not grasp at the moment was how much of that originated directly from Landon personally. Before Little House, Landon had already established a reputation for himself as Little Joe Cartwright on Bonanza, one of the most triumphant westerns in television past. That background molded him not only as an performer, but also as a gentleman who comprehended what spectators desired to experience. So, when NBC resolved to modify Laura Ingalls Wilder's cherished volumes, they understood precisely whom to contact. But Landon was not just presented the part of Charles. He was handed the imaginative controls to the complete series, and he employed them to produce something that would characterize television for almost 10 years. From the very start, Landon tackled the program like a purpose. He desired to narrate tales about genuine individuals, about household, affection, and ethical decisions that counted, but he did not depend on showy outcomes or grand display. Instead, the core of the program was always human feeling. Aspeth managing producer and overseer, Landon formed everything from the mood off the soundtrack to the cadence of the conversation. His imprints were on every sequence, every look, every droplet that dropped on that dusty meadow. Over the years, Landon donned more roles than most Hollywood personalities ever would. He emerged in 187 episodes as Charles Ingalls, created 204, and individually composed or guided many of the most impactful ones, including Remember Me, where he addressed sorrow and perseverance with shattering straightforwardness. He was renowned on location for being orderly and effective, often completing sequences before timetable and below expenditure. But even with that productivity, he never compromised sentiment. If an instance did not seem authentic, it did not reach broadcast. By the late 1970s, Little House had transformed into a television benchmark, an uncommon combination of belief, household, and boundary toughness that connected with spectators of all generations. It was selected for numerous Emmy honors and became one of the most adored family sagas in American past. Yet behind all that accomplishment, there existed another aspect to the narrative filled with imaginative conflicts, concealed irritations, and challenging selections that examined even Landon's tolerance. While the program seemed healthy on display, not everything was as tranquil as it appeared. Little House on the Prairie did not evade from the darker areas of existence. Michael Landon trusted that if households were going to settle together each week, the narratives required to mirror both the loveliness and the agony of being mortal. Under his direction, the program addressed topics that most family initiatives of the 70s would not even approach. Death, dependency, abuse, and bigotry. All of it discovered its path into Walnut Grove. Episodes like May We Make Them Proud investigated the inconceivable sorrow of losing a youngster, while others faced illegal material dependency and societal bias with unprocessed truthfulness. Landon had a talent for interlacing challenging subjects into narratives that still seemed encouraging. He did not trust in sweetening existence, but always trusted in salvation, and that even in the worst instances, individuals could discover illumination again. But that daringness arrived with its portion of opposition. Some reviewers charged the series of being excessively emotional, while others believed it extended too far for a family program. It became one of those uncommon initiatives that appeared to infuriate both sides of the cultural separation, with some naming it too didactic and others naming it too advanced. In contemporary reviews, reviewers still argue whether the program was in advance of its time or an outcome of its era's inconsistencies. Landon, however, never appeared disturbed by the dispute. He always stated the program was not about government. It was about individuals. Even so, there were instances when the program's genuineness was doubted. Historians indicated that certain plot lines extended the reality of 19th-century existence. Teachers condemned the program for its idealized depiction of the boundary. But Landon's emphasis was not chronological accuracy. It was sentimental reality. He once clarified that his aim was not to create a gallery item, but to narrate tales that caused observers to sense something, that caused households to converse to each other after the ending scrolled. But as much as Landon motivated allegiance and respect, he also required flawlessness, and not everyone could maintain pace. His urge for authority and superiority sometimes resulted in strain on location, especially with co-star Karen Grassel, who depicted Charles Ingalls. Grassel would later disclose about compensation arguments and imaginative disputes that rendered their working connection challenging at times. In discussion, she admitted, "I felt offended as his co-star on a success series that I did not want to exploit anybody, but I anticipated a reasonable salary." She also disclosed that Landon once asserted that spectators did not consider her as favored as she believed, leaving her tremendously furious. While both profoundly admired each other's skill in many respects, their perspective for the program sometimes clashed. Despite the obstacles, Landon's control was total. He was the program's pulse, composing, creating, guiding, and performing with a strength that left little space for relaxation. He desired Little House to be more than diversion, and that urge arrived at an individual expense. As the periods continued, the boundary between Michael Landon, the gentleman, and Charles Ingalls, the figure, started to fade. Peppered so much of himself into the part that, by the conclusion, the two were almost indistinguishable. And even as Little House expanded into one of the most symbolic programs in television past, Landon himself was combating private struggles no one could observe. Those individual conflicts would ultimately guide to one of the most devastating sections in his existence: shadows behind the renown. Behind his effortless grin and distinctive chuckle, Michael Landon's existence was overshadowed by agony only a few comprehended about. Long before he became America's preferred parent, he matured in disorder, attempting to endure a residence that did not seem secure. His mother, Peggy, fought profoundly with her psychological wellness, and those fights often burst in alarming manners. Landon would later remember one terrifying occurrence that happened right in front of him. It left a scar that never truly vanished, and the injury formed everything about him, including his urge to safeguard, to produce steadiness, and to construct realms where households always discovered a method to remain united. At institution, existence was not much simpler. Landon was tormented and degraded. He bore a mystery that agonized him for years. His battle with bedwetting, even as a youth, the disgrace from it was intolerable, and the mockery from peers only intensified his seclusion. That background became the base for his semi-autobiographical movie, The Loneliest Runner, where he spilled out those recollections in a manner that finally provided them significance. In the movie, a youthful lad runs to flee his agony, a symbol for Landon personally, who would devote the remainder of his existence outrunning phantoms of his history. When he reachieved in Hollywood, he did not possess fame, wealth, or links. What he possessed was an almost fanatical resolve to demonstrate himself. Early on, he encountered a sequence of refusals, minor roles, and near failures. Casting overseers often informed him he was not quite correct. Not tall enough, not tough enough, not the kind. But Landon possessed something they could not gauge: presence. This irrefutable allure finally ignited when he secured the part of Little Joe Cartwright in Bonanza. Overnight, he became a domestic title. Yet even in triumph, that feeling of uncertainty never departed him. It became propellant. The cause he labored longer periods, composed his own manuscripts, and managed every aspect of his endeavors. He was not pursuing renown. He was attempting to construct a realm where he could never be helpless again. Away from the display, Landon's individual existence was just as intricate. He was wedded 3 times and had 9 offspring, several of whom pursued him into amusement. Insiders portrayed him as enchanting and captivating, but also uneasy, a gentleman who could be profoundly affectionate one instant and emotionally remote the next. He required allegiance, but he also bore a sense of autonomy that sometimes rendered emotional intimacy challenging. Still to his household, he was a narrator, a prankster, and a power-off nature. The father who rendered everything seem achievable. Unfortunately, in April 1991, Michael Landon obtained information that shattered that picture of indestructibility. After experiencing from intense migraines during a getaway, he was identified with pancreatic cancer, one of the most hostile and unrelenting forms of the illness. It was an identification that astonished both Hollywood and his admirers. But taught those who comprehended him best, the astonishment arrived with a recognizable irritation. His daughter, Leslie Landon Matthews, would later state that her parent had always evaded physicians. He was obstinate, persuaded he could force through anything with pure determination. That attitude had benefited him well in his profession, but this time it operated against him. By the time physicians discovered the cancer, it had already expanded. In the weeks that pursued, gossips circulated about what might have triggered his sickness. Some hypothesized that years of shooting near the Santa Susana nuclear laboratory, a location long linked with radioactive pollution, could have contributed a part. Others attributed it to heredity or simple misfortune. Landon personally trusted his smoking and drinking, which he had indulged heavily in during the course of his existence, may have added greatly to the sickness. In May of that year, he performed one ultimate public appearance on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. It was unprocessed, courageous, and unforgettable. Sitting opposite from Carson, his structure thinner, but his spirit still keen, Landon talked openly about his identification. He made quips, grinned often, and even mocked the tabloids for their overstated headlines. He also vowed to combat thrillness with everything he possessed. What impressed everyone observing was not his sickness. It was his elegance. He confronted death the same manner he had confronted every barrier in existence, with truthfulness, wit, and a rebellion that caused you to trust he could defeat the probabilities. Unfortunately, just 3 months afterward, on July 1st, 1991, Michael Landon died at his residency in Malibu, California at the age of 54. His household was by his side, his wife Cindy, his offspring, and his closest companions. As the gentleman who had provided the planet so much consolation finally discovered his own tranquility, information of his demise sent a surge of sorrow through Hollywood and across generations of admirers who had matured with Little Joe, Charles Ingalls, and Jonathan Smith from Highway to Heaven to millions. It seemed like losing a household member. But even in death, Landon left behind more than just a heritage of performances. He left behind teachings on endurance, benevolence, and the significance of narration that communicatesto the soul. And for the performers and staff who had strolled beside him for almost a decade on that little meadow, saying farewell was not simple. Their responses and the honors that pursued disclosed just how profoundly Michael Landon had affected every existence he met. Cast responses and honors. When the information of Michael Landon's demise circulated, the little house on the Prairie household was jolted to its foundation. To them, Landon had not just been a co-performer or a curator. He was the base of everything they had constructed together. For years, he had been the initial to reach in location, the one who established the rhythm and the atmosphere, the individual everyone instinctively turned to when things became challenging. Without him, the realm of Walnut Grove suddenly seemed emptier, as though its directing illumination had extinguished. Melissa Gilbert, who had matured alongside Landon for almost a decade, experienced the loss in a manner few could comprehend. She had entered the program as a youngster and had been formed by his direction throughout her developmental years. Landon had been both instructor and guardian, stabilizing her when fame and youth collided. His impact ran so profound that for her, losing him was like losing household. At this memorial, she talked about what has signified to her and how his power and benevolence had defined her comprehension of guidance. In a later discussion, she stated, "Michael was the field general, right? So, he established the mood of what we were accomplishing. Mine was distinctive in that he was the only cast participant who regularly mingled with him and his household. We'll vacation together during spring break in Hawaii, the same lodging every year. Mike's kids attended the same school I attended. I slept over at their house all the time. They slept over at me house. This declaration rendered it clear to everyone how profound her respect for Landon ran. For Dean Butler, who depicted Almanzo Wilder, Landon's death also left a deep impression. He had observed firsthand the exactness with which Landon operated, the manner he could take a simple narrative and fill it with layers of significance. Landon had an instinct for human sentiment that few overseers possessed. His manuscripts often mirrored actual existence, combining struggle with salvation in a manner that connected far beyond the television display. Butler saw him not just as a maker, but as an creator who had mastered the vocabulary of emotion. He once stated, "I think people respected Michael, but I do not think that he had that industry respect to the merited." He seized audiences in his profound manner and continues Tozai's audiences in an altering planet. He still is able to seize people because there is reality in what he is composing about. Alison Arngrim, remembered for delivering Nellie Olson to existence, pondered on her intricate but respectful connection with him. Landon had been requiring, sometimes sunbending, but his flawlessness came from a place of profound concern. Even when strain emerged, it was impossible not to acknowledge the earnestness behind his urge. After his demise, she came to perceive how much sentimental burden he carried during those years, and how individual many of the program's themes had been to him. His ability to direct his own agony into impactful narration was in her eyes what rendered Little House unforgettable. In the years that pursued, the cast discovered methods to honor his recollection. They reassembled on various occasions, most notably for the Little House 50 podcast, where they exchanged behind-the-scenes recollections and pondered how profoundly Landon had formed their existences. What surfaced from those discussions was not just reminiscence, but acknowledgement of how uncommon his impact had been. Everyone who had operated under him, from performers to staff participants and creators, talked about how his labor morality, empathy, and imagination left enduring mark. Melissa Gilbert often commented that Landon's attendance could alter the entire environment of a location. When he was concentrated, everyone concentrated. When he was lively, amusement spread. He had a manner of delivering serenity to disorder, reminding individuals that what they were accomplishing counted. His guidance was not noisy or theatrical. It arrived from quiet assurance and in steadfast belief in the worth of good narration. Even decades afterward, the cast still portrayed him as the sentimental anchor of Little House on the Prairie. His impact extended far beyond the display, forming how they tackled their labor, their connections, and even their comprehension of endurance. His death indicated the conclusion of a period, but it also solidified his myth. The individuals who had known him best continued to transport his teachings forward, and it was that bittersweet consciousness of everything he left behind that rendered the program's ultimate installment so eerie. When Little House on the Prairie arrived to its conclusion, it seemed less like a resolution and more like a farewell that resounded with the essence of Michael Landon personally. The sentimental goodbye. When the last farewell broadcast in 1984, it was not just another television conclusion. It was a full-scale sentimental occurrence. The series that had defined a generation for almost a decade was approaching to an end in a manner no one could have foreseen. For Michael Landon, it was not simply the shutting of a program. It was the shutting of a section of his existence that had borne both his greatest accomplishments and his deepest sentimental investments. The narrative of the ultimate installment was a daring and shattering selection. The town of Walnut Grove, a place that had come to symbolize household, endurance, and society, was suddenly menaced by a property developer who asserted legal possession of the land. The inhabitants, faced with losing everything they had constructed, made an extreme decision. Rather than permit their cherished town be seized, they would ruin it themselves. It was astonishing, almost inconceivable, the supreme act of rebellion and sorrow. In the installment's concluding sequences, one by one, the people of Walnut Grove ignited the fuses, observing their residences and businesses explode into clouds of vapor and blaze. It was ruining, emblematic, and deeply individual. Each detonation was not just the ruin of a location. It was the ruin of recollections. The little schoolhouse, the chapel, and the shops were all vanished in instances. Observers cried as they observed, not only for the figures, but also for themselves. They were saying farewell to a realm that had seemed genuine, a realm that had become part of their own households. Michael Landon was the designer of that conclusion. He composed it, oversaw it, and performed in it, guaranteeing that the ultimate note of Little House on the Prairie would be as sentimental as it was unforgettable. In many respects, it was his own farewell to the figures, the narrative, and the years that had defined his existence. He returned as Charles Ingalls to guide the townspeople through their concluding instances, providing the spectators one last view of the gentleman who had directed them for so long. Behind the scenes, the environment was burdened. Performers and staff participants later remembered that shooting those concluding sequences seemed unreal, almost like attending a burial. There were instances of amusement between shots, but the weight of what was occurring was undeniable. The detonations, though meticulously arranged, bore a strange sentimental authenticity. When the chapel went up in flames, it was not just a prop igniting. It was the conclusion of something holy. Melissa Gilbert later exchanged how challenging those ultimate days had been. She had matured within those locations, learned her skill there, and constructed lifelong connections under Landon's oversight. Seeing it all diminished to debris left her jolted. Even Landon, usually calm and stable, fought to restrain tears. For someone so in command of his sentiments on location, it was uncommon to see him fracture. But this was different. Little House was not just a program to him. It was a mirror of everything he cherished: household, perseverance, and respectability. Observing it conclude so suddenly seemed like losing part of himself. The selection to conclude the series with such definitiveness was not entirely his selection. NBC had terminated the program unexpectedly, mentioning declining ratings and changing network emphases. Landon had hoped for more. He had schemes for additional TV films that would have continued the Ingalls household narrative. But the network's selection left him with little space to bargain. Rather than permit the program fade silently, he selected to provide it a farewell worthy of its heritage. If it had to conclude, it would conclude on his conditions. When the conclusion broadcast, spectators were astonished. No one had anticipated Little House on the Prairie, a series known for its gentleness and ethical teachings, to finish with detonations. But in Landon's mind, it rendered perfect sense. The ruin was not about aggression or display. It was about sentiment. It symbolized loss, alteration, and the painful reality that even the most treasured things eventually pass. The inhabitants' decision to ruin Walnut Grove rather than see it corrupted spoke to the program's core principles of pride, autonomy, and honor. Critics were separated at first. Some named it overdramatic, even extreme. Others perceived it as one of the most impactful farewells in television past. For the admirers who had pursued the Ingalls household from the very start, it seemed devastating, but truthful. Existence does not always conclude neatly. Sometimes it concludes with blaze, with sorrow, and with the bravery to depart. In the years that pursued, the last farewell became a case examination in how to conclude a cherished series with significance. It was not designed to satisfy everyone, but to cause people to sense. That was Landon's brilliance. He comprehended that good narration was not always about consolation, but about reality. Behind the camera, Landon observed the concluding sequence unfold with a combination of pride and sorrow. He knew he had accomplished what he set out to accomplish, to provide the program and conclusion that no one would ever forget. But as the particles settled and the last sparks faded, he also knew something deeper. Little House on the Prairie had been more than a profession benchmark. It had been his individual voyage and his method of reconciling the agony of his own youth with the affection and household he had yearned for. When the camera ceased rolling, the performers assembled one last time on the vacant location. There was silence, the kind that arrives only when something truly significant arrives to an end. Landon stood among them, surrounded by the remnants of a town he had constructed and ruined with his own hands. He had narrated their narratives, directed their sentiments, and formed their recollections. Now was releasing it all. And as the staff packed up and the meadow grew quiet again, Landon departed from Walnut Grove, closing a deeply individual section in his existence. Yet, even as he proceeded, The essence of that little town and everything it symbolized would pursue him into the next and ultimate act of his existence. Existence after Little House on the Prairie. After Little House on the Prairie concluded, Michael Landon did not slow down for an instant. He continued forming narratives about household, endurance, and belief, but through an entirely fresh perspective. In 1984, just months after saying farewell to Walnut Grove, Landon presented the planet to Highway to Heaven. In the series, he portrayed Jonathan Smith, an angel dispatched to Earth to assist individuals discover optimism again. It was a part that suited him flawlessly. Jonathan was not a showy or otherworldly figure. He was modest, empathetic, and deeply mortal, much like Charles Ingalls before him. Through Jonathan, Landon once again investigated what had always motivated his narration: the quiet struggles of ordinary individuals and the salvific power of benevolence. Highway to Heaven was not just another TV saga. It was a spiritual voyage disguised as a weekly series. Landon employed it to illumination subjects that mainstream television often evaded, from sorrow to impairment, dependency, and absolution. Each installment bore an ethical communication, not in a lecturing manner, but with warmth and earnestness. He comprehended that spectators were famished for narratives that caused them to sense something genuine, and that is exactly what he provided them. The program operated for 5 seasons, gaining steady viewership and a devoted audience. Admirers who had matured with Little House discovered consolation in Landon's recognizable narration approach. His co-performer and close companion Victor French, who had also emerged in Little House, shared Landon's perspective off television as an instrument for mending. Together, they produced a collaboration that seemed effortless. Their rapport on display mirrored their actual existence companionship, and spectators could sense that link. Even behind the camera, Landon preserved his reputation for strength and exactness. He oversaw and composed many of the installments himself, guaranteeing that every narrative mirrored his perspective. Colleagues often commented on his labor morality and how he seemed to function with limitless vitality, remaining on location long after others had departed residence. For him, narration was not just an occupation. It was an objective. Beyond Highway to Heaven, Landon continued to investigate endeavors that mirrored his individual backgrounds. He oversaw Us in 1991, a TV film that was intended to initiate a new series. The narrative centered on an ex-convict attempting to reconstruct his existence after an unjust incarceration, another mirror of Landon's captivation with salvation and second opportunities. It was intended to be his next major section in television. But destiny had other schemes. Even as wellness problems began to infiltrate in, Landon remained dedicated to his labor. He was still cultivating new concepts, still appearing on location, and still forming narratives that caused Pleto trust in goodness until his sorrowful identification and death. To the conclusion, Landon's existence remained defined by empathy, bravery, and steadfast cheerfulness. He trusted television could accomplish more than divert. It could mend, motivate, and remind individuals of their own capacity for goodness. And long after he'd parted the display, the teachings he narrated through figures like Charles Ingalls and Jonathan Smith continued to exist on quietly, powerfully, and eternally. What do you ponder about the ultimate installment of Little House on the Prairie? Place your responses in the remark area below. If you relish this clip, do not forget to tap on the next clip on your display.